Hello everyone, welcome to Achievers IAS classes. Today we shall look into some of the most important events of the month gone by. So let's begin with a discussion on Cyclone Titli and a question being asked in UPSC on tropical cyclones. The Indian Meteorological Department has said that Cyclone Titli has developed into a very severe cyclonic storm which is likely to make landfall. Landfall refers to cutoff of moisture and thereby dissipation of the cyclone. The Indian Meteorological Department has said that 20 to 30% of the tropical cyclones in the Bay of Bengal were recurving instead of moving northwards and westwards, which is worrisome because these recurved cyclones are more severe and cause more damage due to the fact that the eastern coast is a heavily populated area. UPSC has already asked a question on the mechanism of cyclone as well as how the cyclones are named. On the question of how the cyclones are formed, please go back and refer your NCERT textbooks where the process is given in detail along with a diagrammatic representation. We'll look into how the cyclones are named and why the cyclones are named. The World Meteorological Organization and the United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific started the tropical cyclone naming system in 2000, according to which cyclones worldwide are named by 9 regions, namely the North Atlantic, Eastern North Pacific, Central North Pacific, Western North Pacific, North Indian Ocean, Southwest Indian Ocean, Australian, Southern Pacific, and South Atlantic. Cyclones in the North Indian Ocean basin are named by the Indian Meteorological Department, and the 8 countries in the North Indian Ocean region, namely Bangladesh, India, Maldives, Myanmar, Oman, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, and Thailand, prepare a list of names, among which one is picked in an order to name the cyclones. Cyclones are named to provide ease of communication and easy information dissemination for the general public. Now let's move on to some of the issues from the General Studies Paper 2 perspective. The hashtag #MeToo campaign on social media is going on with women from different sectors, particularly working in the media and entertainment industry, has spoke about the sexual harassment they face at workplace. Following this, the center has recently announced that it would set up a panel of judges to look into the legal framework to curb sexual harassment at workplaces. The Sexual Harassment at Workplace Bill, which was formulated based on the Vaishaka guidelines, had put in place an internal complaints committee to look into issues of sexual harassment at workplace. But the Verma committee, which was set up in 2013, had proposed forming an employment tribunal to receive and adjudicate all complaints to ensure speedy disposal and justice for the victims. Further, the report had noted that the tribunal should not function as a civil court but may choose its own procedure to deal with each complaint on a case-by-case basis. The tribunal should be appointed by a collegium headed by the Chief Justice of the concerned High Court and should comprise of 2 retired judges, with at least one of them being a woman, 2 eminent sociologists, and 1 social activist who has experience in the field of gender-based discrimination. Further, the report noted that the Internal Complaint Committee would be counterproductive as dealing with such complaints in-house could discourage women from filing complaints. Therefore, the committee had proposed forming an employment tribunal and had said that an employer could be held liable if he or she had facilitated sexual harassment or permitted an environment where sexual misconduct becomes widespread and systemic. In such a case, the company would be liable to pay compensation to the complainant if found to be guilty. The panel also made several suggestions to encourage women to come forward and file complaints. Like, for instance, it opposed penalizing women for false complaints and also said that the time limit of 3 months to file a complaint should be done away with. On that note, let's move on to the next issue, which is regarding the growing menace of antibiotic resistance. There are 3 major sources of antibiotic resistance, namely the overuse of antibiotics by human beings, the overuse in veterinary sector, and antibiotic contamination due to pharmaceutical and hospital discharge. With respect to antibiotic overuse in the veterinary sector, a recent investigation has found that the world's largest veterinary drug maker, Zetis, has been selling antibiotics as growth promoters to poultry farmers in India, even though it had stopped the practice in the US given the ban in early 2017. India is set to regulate antibiotic use in the poultry sector. Therefore, the drug maker is not liable for his actions in India. This is worrisome because India has the highest burden of infectious diseases and will suffer the most due to drug resistance. The government has taken certain steps, like for instance, to reduce the overuse of antibiotics by human beings. India has classified important antibiotics under Schedule H1 of the Drugs and Cosmetic Rules so that they couldn't be sold without prescriptions. However, these drugs still continue to be freely available in pharmacies with the state drug controllers unable to enforce the law in true spirit. On the overuse of antibiotics in the veterinary sector, no progress has been made, thereby allowing companies to sell last resort drugs to farmers, thereby leading to growing drug resistance. And finally, on the discharge of medical waste, India is yet to introduce standards for antibiotics in wastewater, and due to lack of such monitoring, there is an explosion in resistance genes in these water bodies, thereby requiring urgent steps by the government on all three fronts. Given the high stakes involved, the government cannot neglect the issue but has to take immediate steps in order to prevent drug resistance. Now let's look into the Citizenship Amendment Bill. The bill amends the Citizenship Act of 1955 to make illegal migrants who belong to Hindus, Sikhs, Buddhists, Jains, Parsis, and Christian communities from the neighboring states of Afghanistan, Bangladesh, and Pakistan eligible for Indian citizenship. Further, it reduces the requirements for citizenship by naturalization, which previously required the applicant to reside 11 of the previous 14 years in India to 6 years for persons belonging to these religious communities. Further, the bill also provides for cancellation of the registration of the overseas citizens of India cardholders if they were to violate any law. Due to these provisions, it gave rise to issues like the eligibility of citizenship of the illegal immigrants on the basis of religion was seen as a violation of Article 14 of the Constitution, and also the provision which allowed for the cancellation of the overseas citizens of India registration for violation of any law was seen as ambiguous and vague, for it could be used even for the commitment of minor offences. The bill is in news because the Assam government has recently said that it would not allow a proposed rally of several Bengali organizations in support of the Citizenship Amendment Bill of 2016, which seeks to grant citizenship to non-Muslim refugees from the neighboring countries. On that note, let's move on to the next important issue of the month, which is regarding the recent face-off between the RBI and the central government, which was all too evident in the recent public speech by the RBI Deputy Governor. The central government and the RBI disagree over several issues, mainly the setting of the benchmark interest rates, the lack of adequate powers to the RBI in regulating public sector banks, the conflict over RBI's raising reserves, and the government's intention to use this to bridge its fiscal gap, the creation of an independent payment regulator, which the RBI sees as an encroachment on its regulatory powers, and finally, the recent RBI circular, which redefines non-performing assets and the revised framework for resolution of such assets. These disagreements highlights the complete breakdown of communication between the RBI and the government as a result of the creative tension which is systemically inbuilt given the differing perspectives of the government and the RBI. While the government focuses on the short term and political perspective, the RBI looks into the long term and the technical perspective, and such differing views are good for the economy, but there is no excuse over the turf war between the two institutions given the backdrop of economic turmoil both globally and domestically. Therefore, the central government and the RBI must resolve their differences through discussions as they have done many times in the past in the best interest of the economy. Well, on that note, let's look into the financial crisis in the NBFC sector. The recent default of the infrastructure leasing and financial services over its various debt obligations has raised serious questions about the functioning of the regulators and has also exposed the underlying weakness in the non-banking financial company sector, which has depended heavily on low-cost, short-term debt financing, which is not a sustainable business model. Because at a time when both international and domestic interest rates continue to rise, these NBFCs have come under pressure and their profit margins have reduced due to the rise in borrowing costs. NBFCs were seen as an alternative to traditional banking in certain sectors because the commercial banks were troubled with rising NPAs. However, the recent liquidity crisis in the NBFC sector has raised serious questions on the NBFC model of financing. While the government has decided to replace the management of the defaulting company, the banking sector, namely the RBI, the National Housing Bank, and the State Bank of India, have decided to increase the supply of liquidity in order to keep the interest rates under control. While offering such easy money may be a welcome measure to ease the liquidity crisis, but the prolonged supply of low cost funds to the NBFC sector creates the risk of building an unsustainable bubble of debt in various sectors of the economy, and any eventual state bailouts could fuel a moral hazard as other financial institutions may also expect a similar measure if they were to default in future. Therefore, policymakers should focus on taking steps to address the structural problems which contributed to the crisis, like widening the borrower base of the NBFCs, which, as you know, have been banned from accepting deposits from customers. By allowing NBFCs to accept deposits, these institutions can tap into more reliable sources of funding and also avoid any liquidity crisis in the future. The next important issue was regarding India's energy security. Indian economy has been facing multiple external headwinds like the widening current account deficit, the sliding rupee value, the rising prices of crude oil, all of which could negatively affect the prospects of Indian economy, thereby making it necessary for India to diversify its energy basket. At the recently concluded India Energy Forum, Prime Minister Narendra Modi urged the oil producing countries to reduce the cost of energy in order to aid the global economy in recovering, and also called for a review of payment terms demanding the partial use of rupee instead of the US dollar. This is because India imports over 80% of its oil demand, and in the recent times, oil prices have risen by as much as 70% in rupee terms in the last 1 year. Given that Saudi Arabia, which is one of the prominent suppliers of crude oil to India, has refused to openly commit to lowering the oil prices, the actions needed by the government include reduction in the central and state taxes, which is unlikely given the government's fiscal needs. Apart from this, in the long term, the government has to tap into domestic sources of energy while simultaneously encouraging consumers to switch to green alternatives to reduce crude oil consumption. This will require a stronger policy framework and effective implementation, and also in the short term, the government could also look at diversifying its supplier base to manage any unplanned shocks. Further, the government should also factor in geopolitical risks, such as in the case of Iran, in meeting its energy requirements. Therefore, the energy policy has to be long term and has to be holistic in order to address the energy requirements of a growing economy like India. On that note, let's move on to the next issue, which is regarding the direct tax base of the country. The union government has taken various steps to widen its tax base, which is reflected in the rise in direct tax to GDP ratio, the average income reported by individuals and corporate taxpayers, and also the tax buoyancy factor. The rise in tax compliance can be attributed to several measures like the better gathering of information about the sources of incomes of individuals, the ease of getting refunds, and the lowering of various tax compliance costs. As a result, the total direct tax collection has seen an increase of 18% over the previous year. This widening of the tax base is good news, but the contribution of direct taxes to the total amount of taxes collected by the government still stands at 52%, and also the share of direct taxes has fallen every single year since 2013-14 except for the current fiscal year, which essentially means the rise in the total tax collection in the last few years has come from the indirect tax collections, which are considered to be regressive. Also, direct taxes are preferable from the standpoint of economic efficiency and also help in avoiding the severe distortionary effects of indirect taxes such as the goods and service tax. Further, given the increasing global tax competition, India is likely to face competition from other countries to bring down the corporate tax rates in order to maintain its attractiveness as a profitable investment destination. In this regard, the efforts made to draft a new direct tax code are stuck due to bureaucratic delays, which has to be addressed in order to increase the share of the direct taxes in the total tax collection. Now let's move on to some of the important international issues which were in news last month, starting with the recent worrisome developments in Sri Lanka, which have put the Sri Lankan democracy in peril. The country is already facing economic difficulty due to a plummeting rupee, soaring unemployment, and rising living costs. Also, it is still recovering from the violence and bloodbath during the 3 decade long civil war and is faced with numerous economic and social challenges, particularly with respect to the Tamil and Muslim minorities. Given this background, the recent actions of President Mr. Maithripala Sirisena to withdraw his faction from the ruling coalition and replace Prime Minister Ranil Wickremesinghe with former President Mr. Mahinda Rajapaksa has plunged the country into a political crisis. The situation is further complicated due to the blatant misuse of executive powers by the President to suspend the Parliament ahead of the floor test of the new coalition. By suspending the Parliament, Mr. Sirisena seems to have exposed his insecurity about garnering the required strength, but the upcoming 2 weeks are said to be crucial due to attempts of horse trading and further political uncertainty. Such blatant abuse of executive powers, guided by narrow political interests, reflects the utter disregard for the parliamentary process by letting down the Sri Lankans, including a sizable section of the Tamil and Muslim minorities, which had backed the President Maithripal Sirisena in the critical 2015 election. Such extra parliamentary power struggle is expected to give rise to political unrest, and it remains to be seen the future developments in Sri Lanka and its impact on India given the sensitive issue of ethnic Tamilians in Sri Lanka. The final issue which we'll look into is regarding the Global Hunger Index released by the IFPRI. India has been ranked at 103rd position out of 119 countries in the index, with hunger levels in the country categorized as serious. As per the report, at least 1 in 5 Indian children under the age of 5 years are wasted, which means they have extremely low weight for their height. This reflects acute undernutrition as per the Global Hunger Index. The only country with a higher prevalence of child wasting is South Sudan, and India has also dropped 3 places from its position last year. The 4 main indicators which are used to calculate the hunger levels in the report are undernourishment, which is the share of the population which is undernourished and reflects insufficient caloric intake, and the other 3 indicators used are data for children under 5 years, namely child wasting, child stunting, and child mortality. In these indicators, while the percentage of undernourished people and child mortality has reduced, the prevalence of child wasting has actually worsened not only in India but also remains high across South Asia. Further, The report notes that wasting rates are highest for infants aged between 0 and 5 months, suggesting that attention to birth outcomes and breastfeeding is important. Also, child wasting in the region is associated with low maternal body mass index, suggesting that there has to be increased focus on the nutritional status of women during pregnancy. On that note, I'm wrapping up today's news analysis. Do like, share, and comment to support this initiative. Thank you for watching. Have a nice day.